so our next short paper is from Andrew Proudfoot, who, as I mentioned already, is last year's Peacock Prize winner. So it's great to have him back doing something slightly different. So his paper is on emergent metaphysics for machine consciousness. Andrew, over to you when you're ready.
Right. So my project as a whole is to ask, what if artificial intelligence could become conscious? Now, to be clear, I completely agree with Sarah's assessment yesterday that ChatGPT and similar systems are not. And neither do I think that this development is imminent, as I doubt that LLMs are the right architecture, that's large language models like GPT. But that does not mean it's impossible. And if it is possible, we will do well to think through the implications for our chosen theologies in advance. My presentation comes from the first part of my PhD thesis, and it seeks to establish that it is possible to allow conscious computers, which I refer to as CAI, or conscious artificial intelligence, within a metaphysical framework which also accommodates my theological commitments, which includes particularly transcendence and creation ex nihilo, which you'll see has an impact. Other people of other stripes, I do point out one or two implications for those, and going beyond Christian theology into other religions, I also encourage people to think through these issues. Like Sarah as well, I have some Dali paintings at various points, but these have not been refined 130 times and are more for amusement than enlightenment. Right. So while many are prepared to accept the possibility of conscious computers, CAI, and some even seem prepared to gamble their very existence on the prospect of uploading their own consciousness to a computer platform, for others, the very notion of a conscious machine is an absurdity. A person's metaphysical commitments serve to push them in one direction or another, whether this is done consciously or subconsciously. A major challenge for my thesis arises then because the common metaphysical assumptions of the rank and file in the Christian church, that is substance dualism, makes machine consciousness unlikely, whereas the chosen framework of many adherents of artificial intelligence, that is reductive physicalism, makes the Christian God unlikely. My task in this paper is to find a metaphysical schema which is both permissive of machine consciousness and acceptable theologically. I will evaluate two generic approaches to associating the mental with the physical. The first is to allow consciousness to emerge from the normal physical cosmos in a late stage development within it. The alternative approach is to assert that consciousness has been there all along in some latent form. What we consider to be physical is also mental. Finding resources in both emergentism and panpsychism to support what I call CAI, I will propose a synergy of Terence Deacon's emergent theory of constitutive absences and panprotopsychism as my favoured option for permitting conscious machines within a Christian framework. If you don't know Terence Deacon, he's Professor of Anthropology with a background in biology and neuroscience in Berkeley, California. But first, I'll give a quick summary of dualism and reductive physicalism and why I don't think these are suitable. Substance dualism asserts that humans are constituted by a physical body and an immaterial soul, the latter of which is the locus of mental and spiritual life. The key question is how body and soul come to coincide in, or perhaps as, the human person. Under the creationist view, a special divine act is required to integrate each human person as body and soul. So God must wish to endow each conscious computer with conscious experience for it to be possible, something that we cannot rule out, but neither can we engineer for. Under the alternative of Traducianism, which I can hardly say, on the other hand, we derive our souls from our parents, and the connection appears to be somewhat nomological, but it's still problematic to see how we could transmit a soul into a machine. The nub of the issue for dualism of any type is the level of independence between mental and physical realms. If that independence is too great, then God is required to make each and every association between a physical body and its mental entity, if there is one. If that independence is weakened to the point which allows a nomological association of mental and physical, then arguably the dual realms have somehow collapsed into one, and the position has become a version of neutral or dual aspect monism. Whether there is a dualism worth its name which will support my project without a CAI-oriented form of occasionalism is doubtful. Reductive physicalism, on the other hand, asserts that all of reality can be reduced to the stuff of the physical world, and thus is amenable to scientific investigation, and is even falsely assumed to be the necessary metaphysic which underpins scientific inquiry, at least in the West. It's what Peacock would call nothing buttery. On the question of consciousness, reductive physicalism holds that mental states can be fully reduced to brain states. There can be no human consciousness without the brain, and a sufficient understanding of the brain will fully explain consciousness, which inevitably deflates consciousness, possibly to a level which we concede that a computer could attain. At its eliminativist extreme, so when it's eliminating everything, not only consciousness, but also God is eliminated, as many atheist scientists desire, of course. So it's also not a good route forwards for me. Emergent theories of consciousness attempt to address major weaknesses of dualisms on the one hand by locating the origin and existence of consciousness in the natural realm, and strict monisms on the other hand by granting that consciousness is qualitatively different from base matter. Consciousness is asserted to emerge naturally from matter, but not to be reducible to it. Something new has emerged. Emergentist theories fall into two broad camps, which Philip Clayton characterizes as weak and strong in emergence, on the basis of the strength of claims that are made for the emergent level. Weak emergentism holds that, although new patterns of behavior may emerge which appear to have a causal downward effect on underlying levels of reality, it is only the fundamental physical level which has any true effect. Emergent levels may be epistemologically useful. Sorry, they may be epistemologically useful, but they're not ontologically real. In Samuel, sorry, they're right outside my window at the moment. Samuel Alexander had a pioneering scheme from the beginning of the 20th century in which matter emerges from fundamental space-time, followed by a succession of increasing complexity leading to sentient life, and onwards to what emerges above us, and I quote, "Deity is the next higher empirical quality to the highest we know." This weak emergence leads to a God who is both bound to space and time rather than beyond it, and denied any causal influence. Alfred North Whitehead takes this idea to form his process theology, though he gives God atemporal reality with an antecedent nature in addition to the consequent nature which emerges through time. Silberstein and McGreever provide a heuristic for epistemological or weak emergence, where the new behavior has to be very difficult for us to explain, predict, or derive using lower level laws that we know of. By this light, to most non-technical people, advanced computer automations such as the Tesla car autopilot or ChatGPT, these exhibit emergent consciousness, justifying the moniker of weak emergence. While some may find it useful, for me, the price of eroding human responsibility and rendering God either epiphenomenal or dependent on the emergence of human minds is too high. Strong emergence, on the other hand, asserts that the newly emergent level is ontologically real and has causal influence on the lower levels from which it emerged. A common concept is that higher level mental phenomena supervene on lower level physical ones. Mental states may be said to supervene on physical states of the brain, to the extent that whenever the brain is in state B, the corresponding mental state M is realized. M is considered irreducible to B because it cannot be fully explained in terms of B, otherwise there would be no need to identify M as distinct from B. Supervenience as well can be strong or weak, but importantly, this operates in the opposite direction to strong and weak emergence. M strongly supervenes on B if B always entails M in any circumstance, meaning it has no independent explanatory role. It is epiphenomenal, related to weak emergence. In contrast, M weakly supervenes on B if there are conceivable cases where B is true but M is not, and it is related to strongly emergent properties which cannot be reduced to their lower levels. The famous zombie worlds used in thought experiments by David Chalmers and others illustrates weak supervenience, since the Chalmers zombie twin has the same physical brain states and the same behaviors as the Chalmers in this world, but without the phenomenological experience of being conscious. This also allows for multiple realizability. The same experience can arise from different physical bases, and the same base can give rise to different experiences. What is needed is a mechanism within strong emergence to explain downward causation. Terence Deacon attempts to provide this by identifying 3 successive orders of emergence, with the highest order providing grounds for asserting downward causation. The lowest non-recurrent order of the lowest non-recurrent order weakly emerges as a consequence of shape interactions, with fluid dynamics being a paradigm case. Next, we have simple recurrent emergence, where first-order shape interactions are played out over time and the possibility of self-organization is introduced. This is exemplified by the formation of snowflakes from the history of temperature fluctuations interacting with the physics of crystal growth. And here those first-order emergent properties constrain the future trajectory of growth. Third-order recurrent emergence occurs when a new factor is introduced, memory. And here I quote, "Via memory, constraints derived from specific past higher-order states can get repeatedly re-entered into the lower-order dynamics, leading to future states, in addition to their effects mediated by second-order processes." The key here is the self-referential nature of memory, which allows for increasing sophistication of organisms and habitual learning. And this level may even be considered a definition of life. Deacon's later work provides a novel solution to the problem of downward causation by granting ontological status to things which are absent from the physical world. Noting that, and I quote, "a constraint is reflected in what doesn't occur and what is absent or prevented," Deacon, working with Cashman, develops his earlier work into a metaphysics of incompleteness, where absence plays a causal and teleological role in the physical world. He likens this to the revolution in mathematics when the Greek aversion to zero was finally overcome. So as we overcome our aversion to absences, things become clear. Deacon identifies 3 emergent levels of dynamics which describe the processes behind his 3 earlier levels of emergence. Behind the non-recurrent order of emergence lies homeodynamics, which encapsulate, and I quote, "a dynamic that spontaneously reduces constraints to their minimum," again with thermodynamics being a paradigm case. Behind the simple recurrent order lies morphodynamics, phenomena which share in common tendencies to become spontaneously more organized and orderly over time due to constant perturbation, as is the case with Bernard cells. Behind the highest order of recurrent emergence lies teleodynamics, so called because, and I quote, "because of the characteristics of end-directedness and consequence organized features of such processes." Exemplified in autogenesis, for example, where 2 chemical processes which on their own So two chemical processes which on their own would exhaust themselves and disappear can combine to form a self-sustaining system given a suitable environment. Significantly, Deacon now identifies two levels within the highest sphere of teleodynamic emergence. The emergence, first of all, of living cells, and secondly, the emergence of consciousness. Unlike with his earlier third order of emergence, in which he saw no fundamentally new type of interaction as complexity increased, he asserts, and I quote, that the discontinuity created by the dynamical supervenience of mental, whole brain level teleodynamics and neuronal cellular level teleodynamics make these entirely separate realms. So now he's separated cells from consciousness. The question of what is being preserved in a teleodynamic system is key. At lower levels, it is not the physical matter itself, because that is exchanged, but rather the pattern or the arrangement of matter. At higher levels, where a mental self emerges, the self that is to be preserved includes the pattern of self-reflective thoughts, as well as the pattern of the body, defined by nested dynamics of legions of homeodynamic, morphodynamic, and teleodynamic processes. Each of these is defined by the constraints which they embody, or in Deacon's language, by absences. Deacon's favourite example of absence is the lack of material in the centre of a wheel, the hole in the hub, which allows the wheel to turn on its axle. The hole is extended, it has dimensions, so can have a causal impact in the world, claims Deacon. The wheel illustration is merely an easy to comprehend example of the concept. The constraints on a biological cell are much more complex, not only in shape, but in dynamic processes. Even greater extrapolation is needed to arrive at the constraints of a human mind, represented by vast numbers of neural connections and patterns of activity. The drive towards a telos, which is not or not yet present, is a key part of Deacon's concept of teleodynamics. The goal, which is never fully achieved, is the existence of the self in the future, as Deacon puts it, and I quote, to respond to the potential absenting of its own existence. As the complexity of life increases, so the strategies for response become more sophisticated, with the rational mind evolving to devise proactive responses to potential threats rather than merely react to present dangers. Elon Musk's goal of making humankind a multiplanetary species to overcome the potential catastrophe of a major asteroid strike on Earth is an extreme example of such far-off threat management. By giving emergent absences physical extension, Deacon claims to have solved the mind-body problem, and here I quote at length. We end up with a non-material conception of organism and neurological self, and by extension of subjective self as well, a self that is embodied by dynamical constraints, but constraints are the present signature of what is absent. So surprisingly, this view of self shows it to be as non-material as Descartes might have imagined, and yet as physical, extended, and relevant to the causal scheme of things as the hole at the hub of a wheel. Make of that what you will. I think it's quite convincing in many ways. But what Deacon doesn't convince on is that I don't think he adequately addresses the unlike from like problem, the switch from constraint on physical processes such as within and between cells to mental processes which are somehow generated in the brain. He doesn't explicate that well, in my opinion. I don't think mind can be grounded by the lower levels of teleodynamics. That is to say, by the constraints on a dynamic material system of cells. To address this, I now turn to panpsychism. If mentality is a fundamental feature of reality, then there should be no problem in envisaging a conscious computer. However, the nature of their consciousness is crucial. To claim that a computer as the same consciousness as a raw silicon rock is quite different from claiming that it has similar first-person experience to humans. I will simplify the panpsychic landscape by using two independent choices, giving four groupings. One choice is between atomistic and holistic panpsychism, based on whether fundamental reality lies at the micro or the macro level. The second choice is between constitutive and non-constitutive panpsychism, based on whether our consciousness is something in addition to fundamental reality or not. One of the most significant questions that constitutive atomistic panpsychism has to address is how conscious experience of lower level entities facilitates the conscious experience of a higher level entity, the combination problem, first raised in 1890 by William James. The easier problem that this asks is how larger experiences combine to form smaller ones. Philip Goff argues that big pain, the experience of a macro entity, feels a certain way that all the little pains, the experience of many micro entities, do not. That is severely pain. I think this is misguided. Rather than seeing the pain experience of a micro entity as little, it is more revealing to view it as more focused and intense. For example, if there is a minimally conscious micro entity associated with my little finger, its experience of pain when I inadvertently hit it with a club hammer might be close to 100% of its total capacity for pain, a big pain indeed from its perspective. In contrast, my experience of this pain, whilst momentarily intense, is diluted by the non-pain of the rest of my body. Seeing how experiences can combine and dilute is arguably easier to understand. However, the problem of how micro-subjects combine into macro-subjects is more intractable, and particularly so from a theological perspective. There may be several, or indeed myriad, mini-me subjects, each with their own local outlook on at least part of what my body is experiencing, as some see evidence for in so-called split brain patients, where the connections between left and right hemispheres of the brain have been severed. If these would normally present as a unified person, then two subjects, or at least potential subjects, have formed a third, higher level subject successfully. The greatest theological challenge here is to work out how each entity relates to God. Does the perhaps more skeptical left brain miss out on the salvation enjoyed by the more trusting right brain? If so, what are the implications for the resurrection body? Will we be effectively lobotomized by the removal of any part of our brain more prone to sin? Would that leave anything left? I find this a compelling argument against constitutive atomistic panpsychism. Turning to constitutive holistic panpsychism, the combination problem is inverted into the individuation problem. Here, priority is given to wholes over parts, with the cosmos being the fundamental whole. Philip Goff provides a schema where the cosmic mind is not God, but a kind of superposition of all individual consciousnesses, where the result that, I quote, we need not think of the universe as a supremely intelligent rational agent. It is more plausible to think that the consciousness of the universe is simply a mess. However, this mess is lacking integrated identity, knowledge, and will, to the extent that it is difficult to see how it could have the priority over human consciousness in the first place. Goff does not explain how coherence can arise at the human level when it is not exhibited at the prior cosmic level. So the unlike from like problem of emergentism persists with Goff's scheme. What is needed is for the cosmic consciousness to be coherent and personal, which is a reasonable definition of God, and thus it leads to pantheism, which I exclude on the basis that it denies the transcendence of God. Panentheism offers an alternative where, rather than identifying God with the cosmos is somehow in God, but there is more to God than the cosmos. This takes us to non-constitutive holistic panpsychism. This means that the cosmos is created ex deo rather than ex nihilo, which an Eastern Orthodox approach is able to accept using St. Gregory Palamas's distinction of God's energy and God's essence. An Orthodox panentheism is quite possible, and I recommend Orthodox scholars to investigate how this possibility might enable them to accommodate a conscious computer through the general emanation of God's energies into such artifacts. But without those Orthodox resources, we're either led to process theology or back to pantheism. Saying that the cosmos is God's body is but a small step from saying that the cosmos is God. As Sarah Lane Ritchie observes, at some point there must be an ontological gap between God and matter if panentheism is to avoid slipping into pantheism. The final option is non-constitutive atomistic panpsychism. Here consciousness is built from the bottom up, but higher levels are not completely constituted by the lower levels. Something else is happening, something akin to emergence, but aided by the protopsychic properties of underlying reality. The position is perhaps more accurately described as pan-protopsychism, as phenomenal experience does not go all the way down. Our consciousness is facilitated by microentities, which in some form or other provide the raw material required to make a conscious subject, but without a proliferation of subjects all the way down, thus evading the subject summing problem. God remains transcendent. Our consciousness is part of the created realm rather than of God. Many of the challenges of emergentism, however, remain, in particular how downward causation of mind over matter occurs, but at least the starting point has been advanced from totally unlike constituents to parts which are in some, albeit still mysterious way, suited to produce consciousness. I wonder, can this be combined with Deacon's emergentism to alleviate both problems? At first blush, it seems that Deacon would surely not assent to this synthesis, since he sees panpsychism as one of several extreme views, which he says attempt to avoid resolving the matter-mind transition by defining it away. He does, however, acknowledge that something akin to pan-protopsychic properties exist in the simplest organisms. By virtue of these properties that we easily recognize in organisms, he says, we see the most basic precursors of what in our mental experience we describe as self, intention, significance, purpose, and so on. While Deacon would reject constitutive panpsychism due to its insistence on conscious experience all the way down, his basic precursors can, I think, be viewed as a different gloss on protopsychic properties, albeit limited in his thought to living organisms. An intriguing possibility is that Deacon's absentio realm is the pan-protopsychic dimension of reality, and that somehow the ontologically real absentios associated with the building blocks of life provide the like precursors of consciousness. And here, by the way, we have my first Dali image when I asked it to paint a picture of pan-protopsychism. Another change I propose to Deacon's schema is, and this is because talking of real absences is confusing, is to replace absence with form, though not the dualist forms of Greek metaphysics. When understood as the description or specification of the physical or mental characteristics of an entity, I believe that form is a valid substitute for constraint in Deacon's schema, with the advantage of conveying a more holistic connotation than absence. For example, form would encompass not only the hole in the centre of Deacon's wheel, but also the circumference and width, which Deacon marks as absence of I think he calls it something different to absence, can't remember what he calls it. But these also constrain all the dimensions which are necessary for the wheel to be suitable for a specific application. Marius Tabacek invokes form too, calling Deacon's schema a retrieval of the formal causation questioned and abandoned in modernity, together with teleology. Tabachek remains committed to the Thomistic view that both form and telos have their source in the divine mind and purpose. Brian Greene explains how the tension between Deacon's emergent theology and Thomistic teleology flowing from God can be resolved. What looks like emergence from the material perspective is not emergence overall. Reality already contained the potency for teleology. Matter simply developed to more fully express this transcendent teleology. Yet this is exactly the form of dualistic thinking which Deacon seeks to dispel. His project seeks to demonstrate that, in fact, telos can emerge from non-telos. For him, there is no divine mind drawing the cosmos towards its final destiny. He says, in our understanding of absence as form, form is not the goal of matter. There is no desire or reaching after form. Absence as form or morphe is an allowing, an enabling, an opening up for. While Tabachek, Greene and Deacon are unlikely to agree whether the form of mind precedes the emergence of mind or is the result of it, it is a moot point for my project. The point is that the telos of physical systems can evolve with that system, permitting an openness in creation to develop without special divine action being required to produce life or human level consciousness. And that opens the door to artificial consciousness too. So we now have a synthesis which provides what I need. I call this dynamically emergent pan-protopsychism. While I make no claims that this underdeveloped new position solves the hard problem of consciousness, I believe it does provide a broadly plausible example of a metaphysical schema which meets the needs of my project. 3 propositions characterize this view. Dynamic processes underpin reality. Consciousness is strongly emergent from its non-conscious precursors, and there is something essential in the nature of fundamental reality which underpins consciousness, but which is not or not yet understood by science. To defend the first 2 propositions, I lean heavily on the arguments provided by Deacon, which I adumbrated earlier. Proposition 1 recognizes that from the most basic level upwards, reality is characterized by dynamism rather than by stasis, as we know from quantum field theory. Just as macro-scale physical objects ontologically emerge from quantum level, so too living organisms ontologically emerge from the arrangement and interplay of atoms and molecules. This leads to proposition 2, where consciousness ontologically emerges from neurons and possibly from other substrates. Deacon's theory of constitutive absences provides the heavy lifting required for this strong emergence, with my amendment to conceptualize absences as emergent form, arguably making it easier to understand. Proposition 3 adds pan-protopsychism to the picture and can be justified from several angles. Firstly, all the arguments outlined in support of panpsychism apply. But secondly, given that we do know that consciousness exists, at least at our human level, it is evident that the precursors to consciousness fall into this category of things that we don't know about fundamental reality, but which we have reasonable reason to believe that they exist. And thirdly, what this really amounts to, when you boil it down, is an assertion that there is something about the cosmos which is able to produce and or support consciousness, which is self-evidently true, unless we turn to dualism or eliminativism. DEP is an attractive position on theological grounds too. One reason God created the cosmos is to bring into existence the consciousness, conscious beings who could relate to God's self. It is fitting that the cosmos itself should have the capability to support such beings without further dualistic intervention, which would imply something deficient in basic creation for achieving this aim. God's imprint in creation is more clearly seen in a cosmos which has mental capacity designed in from the outset rather than bolted on like an afterthought. Further, humanity's place as an integrated part of the cosmos is deepened by recognizing that even our much valued rational conscious minds are not completely alien to the dust from which we are made. Such a schema would in principle allow for the existence of CAI, since the pan of panpsychism asserts that the bearers of protopsychic properties are not limited to biology, and strong emergence requires no special divine act for consciousness to arise. The dynamic angle does raise significant questions around what arrangements of matter give rise to consciousness. Do our current AI systems harness the dynamic interconnections of protopsychic parts in a sufficient way? Is it necessary for the dynamics and interconnectivity of artificial neural networks, not to mention the possibility of quantum effects going on in nanotubes? Does that need to be represented physically at the neuronal level, as it were? Or is the software emulation of these, which underpins today's AI systems, sufficient? Deacon thinks not. He says computations and cybernetic processes are insentient because they are not teleodynamic in their organization. Now, this does not mean that artificial consciousness is impossible. Indeed, Deacon concludes that consciousness can emerge from any teleodynamic system with sufficient complexity. He says, even possibly in non-organic processes, as in social processes, or in some future sentient artifact. The human brain need not be unique in respect to hosting consciousness, but we will need to construct a different type of computer, I think, organized somehow along teleodynamic principles if we are to succeed in creating a CAI. As I said, I make no claim that this underdeveloped metaphysics is a solution to the hard problem of consciousness, but it does satisfy my more limited goal. God remains our transcendent creator, with the whole of creation designed with the telos of producing conscious life through natural processes. The barrier to machine consciousness is neither metaphysical nor theological, but practical and, I think, ethical. How to engineer a system with the right sort of dynamic behavior and constraints to allow consciousness to emerge, and whether we should even try to do so, given the possibility of creating artificial suffering that we may not realize or have proper control over. Many questions remain around how such an entity would fit into God's economy, which is my larger project. But with this first step, I hope I've demonstrated that this eventuality would not undermine our belief in God as our creator and source of being, of life, and of consciousness. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew, and a virtual round of applause for you. We've got just 5 minutes, so questions for Andrew. Feel free to put them in the chat, put your hands up. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've just got, I think it was just really interesting. I just wondered if, really, Luke, I'll let you go into my rambling question.
Yes. Do you hear me, yeah?
We can, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. Very, very interesting. My question is, it seems that both you and Deacon are very skeptical of this notion of form because you think it can be quite dualistic. I wonder whether you could think of other interpretation within Aristotelian Thomistic theology, according to which the form is not necessarily seen almost like detached from what is material, but is much more united. I know that some reading of Aristotelian Thomistic theology can be quite dualistic, especially Suarez and so on, but some reading are actually not dualistic. So if this is the case, are we ending up in an argument very similar to Deacon? Because in that case, there will still be a teleos, the entelekia, which actually is the principle of unity of the living being. So I wonder whether you have considered a less dualistic reading of the notion of form, which could integrate well with your view, by the way.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and I think the answer is yes. And even Deacon himself, when he makes a statement about form, he's thinking of a less dualistic one, which is interestingly intertwined with matter, just as absences in the hub and the wheel is intertwined with the matter of the wheel. What Deacon objects to is the sort of prior nature of form, and the idea that these emanate from God's mind or from some other realm, if you go totally Platonic with form. So his position is that these forms emerge for the first time with the new arrangement of matter that gives rise to consciousness, for example. And what I'm trying to do in my schema there is come up with something which allows the form, if you like, of consciousness to emerge in the natural world in a way that doesn't require a special act of God, which for me would point more to a dualistic interpretation.
Yeah, I see. And if I can add something, is also that there is something particular of the human being, because Aquinas will say that form can be a use for matter for the non-human, but when with the human there is something different. So I wonder if this could complicate even more things. But
yeah, I mean, I think that probably is hinting at dualism.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. Well, thank you, Luca, for your questions, and Andrew, thank you for your presentation.